Hello, friends. John Meyer here on the Lead More podcast. Welcome back. Today, I'm really excited, bringing in a friend, a mentor of mine. His name's Dustin Riechmann. Dustin runs a group called the Seven Figure Leap. Seven Figure Leap is a company that does a couple things. They run like a mastermind of like-minded coaches, consultants, agency owners. And then he has a program called the Podcast Profits Accelerator. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Dustin's kind of known as like the podcast guesting guy. He helps people get onto podcasts. He helps you perform when you get onto those podcasts and then use the guest appearance to grow your business, to grow your brand, to make profits, to sell a course or a service or a product, whatever it might be. The truth is, and we talk about in this episode, podcast, being a guest on a podcast, is an incredible medium to get people to know, like, and trust you. And we know at the end of the day, we do business and we work with people that we know, like, and trust, right? So it's almost like a medium, a channel to do the same thing as word of mouth, a referral type of marketing, right? When someone says, you need to work with John, he's a great coach, you should talk to him. Well, when you sit and listen to someone for 30, 40 minutes on a podcast, you start to know, like, and trust them, and it becomes an incredible channel. So what Dustin does is he helps you execute that strategy, find the right shows, get on the shows, perform on those shows, and then ultimately profit. So in this episode, we talk about the power of podcasting. We talk about the power of being a guest on podcast. And then Dustin breaks us down his framework, the 5 Ps of what to do to get on the shows and make sure it's a success once you're on them. So Dustin's a servant heart. He loves to give. He loves to help. You'll see that in this episode. So really excited for you to listen. If you're on the video, I do apologize. We're going through seasonal change here, of course, in the fall in South Dakota. And so there's a lot of bright light coming into my office right now. And if you're watching the video, you'll notice that. So I apologize for that. We'll get that adjusted here moving forward. But with that, here we go with Dustin Riechmann. Hey, friends, welcome back to another episode of the Lead More podcast. I'm super excited. My friend Dustin is here today. Dustin, how you doing?
I'm doing awesome. How are you?
I'm doing great. So I first, I met you through Jordan, who was recently on the show, and he said, you got to talk to Dustin. And then it was I think a voice note, and all of a sudden off we went and got to learn about podcast guesting. We're going to talk about podcast guesting today. And I think that's an interesting concept to be known for because, I remember that Onion article that was like, 300,000 podcast hosts are looking for a guest this week. It was making fun of all the ideas of people starting podcasts, right?
Yeah.
But you're helping people do the guest side. So give us the quick TLDR of why is podcast guesting a strategy for business, for leaders?
Yeah, and I'm happy to get into my weird story of how I stumbled into this. But yeah, to kind of start with the meat and potatoes first. I think this is just one of the best marketing channels out there. If you're an expert, if you have a story, if you have a framework or something you love to teach, there's a lot of reasons for that. I think one of the primary ones is it's long form educational content. So you actually get the attention of your ideal clients for a long time. The other thing I love about podcast guesting is it's a way to build like high quality relationships at scale. And so that's pretty unique, in a world of digital marketing. I've been in digital marketing for 15 years. So in a world of content, social media, SEO, ads, all that stuff has its place, but I think this is a really special medium because of the level of connection you can get, not only to the host, but to their audience. And I think that's on the nose, that's like the big differentiator.
Yeah, because if I was like, hey, let's sit down for 45 minutes and let me tell you about my business, you'd be like, yeah, no thanks.
Yeah, I'll send you an invoice and we'll make it happen. Yeah, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so tell me, let's go back then. Tell me about your story about how you kind of became the podcast guesting guy, because that's a random sort of journey, and I know not what you expected.
Absolutely not. Yeah. So the quick story is I was actually an engineer, a traffic engineer, but not website traffic like, cars. So I was a traffic engineer, civil engineer for 15 years. And in that time, had some entrepreneurial sort of roles, but I never had the entrepreneurial itch scratched. And so I started to do online business back in 2009 and got over into this world through marriage and marriage ministry. My wife and I were involved in, and started speaking and writing a book and all this kind of stuff. That's really relevant because it got me deep into digital marketing. And so in that journey, over the course of several years, I fell in love with it, was taking vacation time from work. And instead of hanging out with my family, I was going to like marketing conferences. ultimately that paid off. And in 2018, I left engineering behind and became a marketing consultant. Basically means I took gigs wherever I could get them, doing pretty much anything online marketing for local and
Hmm.
actual online businesses. And part of that was a partnership that formed with a company called Fire Creek Snacks. So it's like a physical meat stick. And that came out of a local butcher shop client that I formed a business partnership. We came online with his products. And that was pretty awesome. And I learned a ton of new marketing and sales and started going to trade shows and selling into brick and mortar. And I enjoyed that until about March 2020 when when I was driving to a trade show and it was canceled. And then I
Yeah.
came home and I was like, oh, that's not good. And then realized that my clients were shut down in my state, and I was like, that's really not good. And so that was my exposure into podcast guesting. It started in summer 2020. Basically as a new way to market meat sticks that wasn't toe-to-toe sampling. And yeah, so I started doing it just as a sort of a prayer of like, what else can I try? Because I can't leave my house. And it turned out that not only was I pretty good at it, but it was very effective. And just kept doing that on repeat for that brand. You know how things go over the course of a year or two of doing that for myself, and people hearing that story, they started asking me for advice and how do you do this. And so I started coaching people, and then that coaching turned into some group coaching, and then that group coaching kind of got married up with a lot of this other marketing experience and business strategy work I love to do. And I created a program called the Podcast Profits Accelerator just over 2 years ago. And so as things progress, that's become my full-time focus the last 2 years. And as I sit here today, I'm suddenly the podcast guesting guy, like 4.5 years in the making.
Oh, I love that. I mean, you just kept pulling on the thread of kind of the opportunity that came to you, and also became the coach, not because you're like, I want to coach podcast, but like you did it by doing it, which I think
Exactly.
is the best way. Um, and I'm guessing you'll say yes to this because you were able to your medium was meat sticks. So like, I'm guessing you can get on podcasts to talk about anything. You would probably say.
I would say, yeah, podcast guesting is a great strategy, especially if you have any kind of online business, right? If you're a local dentist, I mean, there's applications of this where it makes sense for reasons beyond lead generation. But really, if you're doing it to generate leads and grow a business, it needs to be a business that can sell online, because that's the beauty of podcasting is it's so universally available to people, and you can reach many people at many different times, kind of asynchronously. So yeah, as long as you have an online business, that it's great. And although I got it done with meat sticks and we have some really cool stories, and grew that brand to 7 figures with that channel specifically, that's not the best application. The best application is really for, I think, more your audience, right? So coaches, consultants, agency owners. So people are doing like higher ticket services. Could be B2B. It could also be, B2C. We serve marriage coaches and parenting consultants and stuff like that. But mostly like B2B coaches, consultants, agency owners is like the sweet spot, because it's based more on quality than quantity. And so going deep with fewer people with this medium is really effective for people with that business model.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And so you talked about geography, like scaling around geography, having an online component. But earlier you also mentioned sort of I imagine part of the beauty of podcasting is like the intimacy, the trust, the authenticity. Like, tell me about why you think podcasting is such a good channel to build for marketers.
Yeah. So I mean, if you're familiar with marketing, if you're listening to this and you know the cliche, know, like, and trust, right? Like you got to know someone, you got to like them, you got to trust them. And as things have evolved or devolved, however you want to look at it, that's become much more difficult. So, it used to be like 7 touches, then it was, I don't know, 27. Now I think it's like 700. I don't know. It's a lot of touch points before people recognize who you are, understand what you do, trust you enough to actually purchase something from you. Especially if you're selling a higher ticket, service, like
Yep.
again, like you and I and a lot of our clients and your audience. One of the great things about podcasting is you get to kind of close that loop, or at least go very deep into that process, sometimes in one interview, right? So like in one interview, if you're teaching something people really care about and you're telling the stories in a way that really relate and connect, and you make that emotional connection, a lot of times people know, like, and trust you at least enough to like maybe opt into your world, but sometimes enough to even purchase from you from one interview. And that's very different than what I would call quote unquote traditional digital marketing, which is very multi-touch oriented and and very long, long cycle as far as building
Sure.
that acumen. Yeah.
And I suppose another one would be, besides that, know, like, and trust. Also, talk about why a podcast, just the long tail or the longevity of a podcast episode is really interesting, right? I'm guessing you have stories and use cases of someone who heard you somewhere at some time, maybe years later, that
Yeah.
lead to something.
Yeah, all the time. I mean, I still, it's less and less frequent, as there's some decay and, in time. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people think of YouTube in this way, and that's obviously true of YouTube, but also true of podcasts, that you might do an interview, but then, and when it gets published, you'll get a spike of activity. But long tail, meaning 6 months, even 6 years later, it still exists. And so people may be looking for you, they may be looking for your topic. I've had instances where maybe I was on one of the earlier episodes of a show, and that show grew over time and kind of took off. And people do the binge thing, and they come back to the early episodes, and they're like, "Man, I heard you talking about snack sticks, from 2021." And then they look for me, and they find out, oh, he actually does coaching on this whole thing now. This is really interesting. So yeah, the long tail is a real thing. This is not a podcast specific example, but literally yesterday, someone contacted me. I had a call with someone. I'm like, man, his name seems familiar. Another John Marino. And so we got on this call. I'm like, I know you. He's like, well, I know you. And he's like, and the reason I know you is we were in the same room in 2014 in Austin, Texas at this conference. And for some reason you came to mind. And I've looked and I found, this was a YouTube thing, but he's like, I looked up your name and I found this testimonial video you gave in 2014 from this event that we were at. And I was like, I started looking and I started to see what you're doing now. And so he just joined my flagship program like yesterday. And I literally talked to him for 10 years. Now, I wish that was a podcast story to make the point. But that's an extreme example of the long tail effect of planting these seeds and being visible and teaching. And it definitely can create long-term benefits. And then another more techie thing, if anyone's listening and they are into like SEO, like search engine optimization, we're always trying to build backlinks and stuff. This is like a really ninja way to build backlinks to high authority sites. So if you get interviewed on their podcast, they link you to the website. So there's a lot of these more nuanced marketing benefits. But yeah, the main ones I think are relationship building and connection with the audience.
So I imagine you would say yes to this, but before we dig into the how and the tactics, there's this, I made that joke about the Onion article, but this feeling of like, are there too many podcasts? Like, who's actually listening to these shows? How many people, download? Me and my buddy decide to talk about fantasy football, or who actually care, whatever it might be. Talk about just like, have we hit peak saturation? I know they say if you get to like 20 episodes I'm on the host side, you're in the 95th percentile or whatever of people on podcasts. So speak to how you think about where our podcast headed in terms of saturation and density.
Yeah, it's a great question. Really relevant. They call that pod fade, right? Where everyone starts a podcast and they do like 2 episodes and they realize it's actually a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I did, after 3.5 years of just guesting, I did start my own podcast this year. So I understand that, I'm 40, 50 episodes in. It is real. I don't have the very specific numbers right now, but I know in going to some conferences earlier in the year, something like 4 million quote unquote podcasts exist. However, when you really dig into it, only about 450 to 500,000 are active, meaning they've actually been updated in the last 90 days and they've published more than like 5 episodes. So it is a big number, but when you really boil it down into the podcasts that are relevant to what we're talking about, which are niche specific interview based podcasts, it's not that big a number, but it is a big enough number that unless you're in a really obscure niche, it's kind of an infinite opportunity. I mean, there are plenty of opportunity, but I also don't feel like if you do it strategically that it's too ambiguous. Like you can still find the right shows and be very strategic and build the list of shows you want to be on. So yeah, it is and I think there's maybe the Onion article came out of this. There's a lot of people that came on and started podcasts during COVID, like 2020, there's a huge spike in new podcasts. And then the next year, there's this huge drop of active podcasts. So these headlines of podcasting's dying, but in reality, it was just kind of a false spike because people didn't have anything else to do and they were just starting new projects. I think if you cut out 2020, it's a pretty steady line and it is growing. And I think more and more individuals, and I would say like, I don't know, high net worth, but like well-educated people who are busy and active particularly consume a lot of podcasts. So if you
Yeah.
think of yourself, my wife, myself, I think of the people in my circle, the people who are business oriented, who are like high achievers, who are on the go, they pretty much consume podcasts on a regular basis. And I think if that's your target market, especially, it's a beautiful medium for
Good
that.
market. Yeah, absolutely. Um, okay, cool. So, and that long tail of YouTube resonates with me too, right? Like everyone thought that, oh, there's too many YouTubers, like I can't do
Yeah.
that. And we still have these people emerging as these, smash kind of YouTube stars. So, um, before we get into the process, the last one I want to ask is like a success story, because you've coached a lot of people, and I also want to hear your own. Your sign behind you says 7-figure leap, and you help people like coaches and consultants and agency owners go on this proverbial like 7-figure leap of building $1 million businesses on the backbone of podcast guesting. So share sort of either yours or another testimonial of someone who's just used this medium to explode their business.
Yeah, I got like 130 to choose from. But so my own, I'll say meat sticks for $1 million. That's a pretty cool story. And
Yeah.
I've done a lot of interviews about that. If people just want to look up my obscure name, they'll find those. And then this business, to give people an idea of this business, which was grown primarily through podcast guesting. And I always say podcast guesting is a continual building, flywheel, but it also spins off a lot of other opportunities. So it's not like all my leads come from podcast guesting, but in the early days they did. And this business, I basically started taking it serious, I'd say in 2022. It was like a $50,000 business. Last year it was like a $500,000 business, and this year we did hit that 7-figure run rate.
It's amazing.
So I'm got the trophy somewhere back here. I'm a 7-figure solopreneur, and I think that's awesome, and I'm very grateful for that. But I'm certainly not unique. I mean, a couple stories, a couple examples, real quick. I mean, one would be Jordan Godby, who was on the show very recently. I saw
Yeah.
Jordan's in our mastermind, and again, I never take credit for anyone's success, but he did hit his hockey stick when we were working together last fall. And one of the opportunities that came out of our work together, and again, his own great work, was he was on Ali Abdal's YouTube podcast pretty recently, right? And that huge opportunity, 5 million plus subscribers. He's got a ton of growth from that. I won't divulge his numbers, that's his business, but he's definitely on that 7-figure run rate trajectory from this in the course of like a year. And then Lachey Lewis is another one of my favorite case studies. If anyone's on LinkedIn, they should definitely follow Lachey. She was in my program 18 months ago. I actually did a workshop with her last week, so this is very top of mind. And she's very public. She's doing a build in public sort of content strategy. And so you can go look at her LinkedIn and see her screenshots. And she went from literally working 2 jobs as a W-2, taking some of that money, investing in our program specifically. We helped her develop a strategy, and she got on a really key podcast with Exit 5 and just kind of went to the moon. So she's doing 30,000-40,000 a month in monthly recurring revenue right now, doing her like nerdy SaaS consultancy. She's got a very niche bottom of funnel content for SaaS companies, like a very niche topic, but it's
great.
I think if you, in her words, it's all been fueled by podcast guesting. So I think those are 2 kind of easy examples. They're public examples too. So if you go look at Jordan or Lachey on LinkedIn, they've both done a great job this year of documenting that journey and showing the results they've gotten from individual shows and things like that.
Yeah, I love that. It's like you can have this slow and methodical foundational growth, and also have the rocket ship, but like what you're building isn't 15 minutes of fame, right? You're kind of stacking these wins and these appearances to have some of that long tail growth that's sustainable as well, which I think is so huge.
Because when you build relationships at scale, you do have the effect as any marketing channel. If you do it systematically and you're tracking it and you're doing it consistently and you have a strategy obviously behind it, it does give predictable ROI, right? Like, so you just kind of put in the reps, you will get certain results. And, we have a guarantee in our program, and it's based on that. It's like, hey, if you do this the number of times that we tell you, and you do it in a way that's strategic on the right shows with the right story, like you will generate X. In our case, it's like $100,000 marketing channel per year. That's like the consistent, I won't say guarantee, but that's the consistent path. What I think is really cool about podcast guesting, though, you're also kind of playing the lottery at the same time. And so you never know which relationship is going to like change your life, right? And so I call them unicorns. In the Fire Creek world, we got into biggest subscription box company in the country. We got into Walmart, like these crazy things that it wasn't a cause and effect. Like I did one interview and then someone called me and said, you should be in our store. But it was very much a relationship that turned into an introduction, that turned into a opportunity. And these unicorn relationships do come very predictably, but you just don't know which one's going to come in advance. So it's kind of fun. It's kind of frustrating sometimes. But if you do it enough, you get the Exit Fives, or you get the Ali Abdals, or you get the Walmarts, because you're putting in the you're creating the surface area for that quote unquote luck, right?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's networking in sort of a fun way. You're accumulating these positive relationships, not in the I'm gonna take, but like, you're adding value and just kind of see what happens. So I
Exactly.
like that idea of the surface area. So okay, I think we've probably appropriately teased out the power of podcasting, and I thought the seven-figure leap story would certainly hook folks. So give us the drive-by, and obviously you teach a program that dives into this that's multiple weeks. But just let's go through. You have the 5 Ps framework to podcast guesting, and I want you to break us down and take us through it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So call it like the 5P method. Not surprisingly, it's 5 words that start with P. So I will I will zip through those and I'll go back to each one and kind of give the snapshot of what it means.
Okay.
And as I go through these, just keep in mind as a listener that this is in order. Like it's very important. You can't like start with step 4. It really is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sequential process. And so 1 is purpose, 2 is plan, 3 is pitch, 4 is perform, and 5 is my favorite one, it's profit. So when we think about these in order, number 1 is purpose. And really that's answering very clearly the question of why. It's like, why do I want to be on podcast? And that sounds kind of a silly question. It's, oh, make more money. Yeah, but very specifically, who am I trying to reach? What message am I trying to deliver? And what is my call to action going to be, right? Like what is the KPI that I'm driving? So I can't take the engineer out of me. Like everything is very measurable and results oriented. So setting a very clear purpose from the start is ridiculously important, and it's the thing that almost everyone skips. So step 1 is purpose.
And ironically, I'll say, as someone who's gone through your program, I call this chocolate and broccoli in my coaching. We come for the profit, right? We come for the 5th P. I'm going to build a podcast channel. But that's the chocolate, but maybe we actually need some broccoli. And I think you spend a lot of time with your folks of getting clear on that purpose and, what is our mission and what's the sentence or the statement that you can offer uniquely to the world. A lot of that clarity I felt like was one of the best parts of the program.
Yeah, and we started out of the gate with that, and it's one of those things. It's hard to sell. Sell them what they want, give them what they need. People want the shiny result, which is leads and sales, which we deliver. But many times, almost every time, really, what they need to get that is much more clarity on what's the transformation they provide their client. What are the words their client is thinking and feeling that's going to be a magnet to that, right? And then where are those people hanging out? And so once we get clear though on that purpose, which we spent a couple weeks. I'm a story brand guide. I'm actually wearing the story brand shirt if you're on the video. And so we have story brand frameworks, which are very powerful. I have my own stuff that I had before I knew about story brand, but we look at that from multi angles because it's really important. But once we know why we're going to do this, then step 2 is plan, and that's basically a list of podcasts, right? So it's once we know why we're going to do it and who we're trying to reach, it's way easier to sift through all that proverbial noise and find the shows that would want us, their audience would be very receptive to our message. Mm-hmm. And we can identify them and literally like put them on a list and prioritize them. So it becomes very tangible very quickly when you get to step 2. So once you've got a list of shows, which are, which shows you want to be on, then we move to step 3, which is pitch. So the dirty secret here is, there's some sorority sisters and fraternity brothers who are like, come be on my show, bro. And like that happens. But most of the time, people get on shows by asking, right? Yeah. And showing that they have value to provide the audience. And so that's really what pitch is. It's compelling the host to say, yeah, like I would love to have you on my show because you're demonstrating a win-win-win relationship. You're going to go on there and teach, share, connect, and it's good for their audience, which is good for the host, and it's good for you because you're getting exposure to your message and your brand. But that step 3 is pitch. Like, how do you get?
I think about sometimes, I have had guests on my show because I feel like I work hard at growing my network and I go to places and I try to meet people. And so, yes, some of them are friends or people I've met. But then I also think of I think way back to maybe episode 6 or 7. I had Kim Scott. She's the author of Radical Candor, one of my favorite business books. And people are like, "Oh wow, how'd you get Kim Scott?" And the answer was like, I sent her a DM on Twitter.
Yeah.
Like that was it.
Yeah.
I asked, yeah,
Yeah.
and she said yes. And so there
And,
really was no more science behind that.
and we teach this in it's literally a template, and like you customize it, right? It is that, but it's like anything that you learn well. Once you learn it, it has so many different applications. Like, I don't want to go off too big of a tangent, but there was one of my very first coaching clients. He actually ironically, he worked at Walmart before Fire Creek was in there, and he had a YouTube channel, and he was doing real estate investing advice, and he hired me to help him with that. And so it's very parallel, right? But what the fun part of the story is, his wife also worked there in the corporate at Walmart, and she was a designer. And she's
Hmm.
like, man, I would give anything to like be an intern on this HGTV design show that's in Bentonville, Arkansas. And he's like, could you do a session with my wife? And I'm like, sure. So I basically teased out her story and all this stuff, and we basically wrote a pitch. That pitch got sent to her producer, and she ended up quitting Walmart. She's now a full-time designer for HGTV. And so it's not, it's the same psychology, it's the same art and science of compelling someone to show you have value. And so of course we first apply it for podcast guesting, but to your point, like, yeah, whether you could be a host and compel guests to come to you. In this case, we're a guest trying to get on someone's platform who has a show. But step 3 is quote unquote pitching, and then once they say yes, then step 4 is perform. And so again, this is an area a lot of people unknowingly struggle with, where they've been on quite a few podcasts and they just don't get results from it. And there's multiple reasons for that, but one of them is there's no there's nothing compelling about their interview itself, right? So how do you introduce yourself? How do you position yourself? What stories you're going to tell to like connect with the audience and show that you have unique value and that you're someone that they would actually like to work with and learn from? And then most importantly, what's your call to action, right? Like, what do you do at the end of the interview to get the right people to take the next step? And so we coach people a lot on that. So, again, like I won't get into too many examples, but I've had the pleasure sort of anonymously of working behind the scenes with people who are going to have really big opportunities, and they're scared to death of like, I'm going to be on this huge podcast. What do I say? And these
Yeah.
are really articulate, successful people, and coaching them through that is to me just the same as coaching someone for the very first interview they've ever had. And it's about confidence and giving them the tools to make it feel as easy as possible. But that's step 4 is perform. So how do you
Well, I
actually
think
do well?
it's not that those opportunities aren't make or break in terms of you can't probably mess up your business, but like they can be transformational
Yeah.
on some of those particular episodes. Those what did you call them? The like I don't know,
Unicorns.
the unicorns. Yeah, when you're
Yeah,
on
yeah,
those unicorns, you truly could open up a 7-figure leap because of
absolutely.
one show.
Yeah, I mean, I've had clients on Amy Porterfield's show, and at least one client on Ali Abdal's show,
Yep.
and some
For
others.
now.
Not to name names, but yeah. But the point here is not those necessarily. That's very much the 1% of the 1%. Almost all of the success and revenue that our clients generate are what I would call like small to medium sized shows. But it's still important to do a good job and get your message across clearly. That's probably the biggest thing. But that's what we coach people for. So step 4 is perform.
One more thought on perform, just
Yeah.
because you're talking about small to medium sized shows. Is it one of those things where like, someone's listening to this and thinking like, well, a business coach is kind of generic, or a consultant, they can help a lot of different people. I imagine there's no niche too small, even for podcasting, right? Like the more specific your service or product is, there's a podcast out there that's probably just a home run for your audience, right?
Yes. And I would say the place where we get the most breakthroughs in this part of the mindset is getting crazy specific. So like an example that comes to mind for me is I was working with this guy. He does like tax resolution. You hear these guys on the radio, like, oh, if you got trouble with the IRS, call us. And and he was kind of an older dude, and he's like, yeah, like, I don't know where to start. Everyone needs tax help. And I'm like, okay. Like, I was like, but if you could only work with one client, like think of you've been doing this a long time. Think of the top 3 clients, right? And then tell me about them. Okay. So we got down to this. The client would be like a family farm. He's like, they have lots of wealth. It's very complicated. And when someone passes away, it's all screwed up because there's so many implications for taxes. And I was like, that's really interesting. I was like, well, what if we well, I wonder if there's podcasts that cater to multi-generational family farms. He's like, there's no way. And there was. And we found, I mean, it wasn't a huge number, but there were like 5 very specific. And like all they did was interview like multi-generation farmers, right? Like the grandpa, dad, and son, and they would come on and tell their history, their 100-year. And I'm like, this is your platform. Like imagine you had relationships with any of these people, and then they had other experts on that assisted farmers in this, in this situation. So anyway, yes, you can get very, very niche, and a lot of times, and we can go back to that. That's kind of in that step 2. It's finding your vein, not to be too crude, but like the vein you want to tap into, like you find the right vein, and there's a lot of gold in there. And a lot of times that's getting more specific, not less. But yeah, so those are the first 4 P's. So purpose, plan, pitch, perform. I think of those as more of the podcast specific P's. Like there are assets that are created with this. There are customized. You can think about it, right? I have a list for my business of podcasts I want to be on. I know my one-liner. I know my stories. I have my pitch that I'm going to send, right? And then I'm trained up. I know how to like deliver an interview. Step 5 is profit. And so this is sort of the this is the one that gets real deep real quick, because our 90-day program that John experienced, like 30 days of it, like a third of it is the first 4 P's. So those are very important, but it's not that important, so inside of 30 days, we've got people nailed on all the stuff they need to perform well and find the shows and all that. We spend 2/3 of our time on profit. So how do you monetize each of these opportunities? So we could do a whole episode just on this, but in a sense, the question here is, how do you create a flywheel effect with these podcast opportunities to generate, in most cases, leads and sales? Now, again, it goes back to purpose. Like, what are you actually trying to accomplish with this? Whatever those KPIs are, that's what we're revisiting in step 5 to say, okay, now you're getting on shows, you're getting things published. Now what are you going to do about it? So it's the thing in the interview, but most of it happens after the interview is published.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you find is a few tactics there in that post interview published? Because I think this is some of the parts of the course that I was like, oh, that's so obvious, but I didn't think about that. Right?
Yeah. There's a lot here. I mean, I think a fun one I like to talk about that usually is kind of like, I hadn't thought about that, but it's really, really useful. So if you're listening, if you've ever been on a show already, this is also super useful. Like you don't even have to be on new shows to do this. And that would be like what I call mining the guest list. I didn't realize I have so many analogies for like, tapping the vein of gold and mining the guest list. We're like prospecting here, I guess.
But you're a 49er. You're like exactly. Headed west.
I need like an axe instead of a guitar behind me. So like mining the guest list. So really simple example here. So you get on a show, it gets published. You think, hey, I did a good job, and that was a good audience. Like that felt like a really good interview. Me and the host really resonated. And we eventually teach you to have a virtual assistant do this in deference to John and scaling, but just call it you for now. You would go look and say, cool, all of these other people have been interviewed on this same show, right? So maybe there's 200 other people. They've all been interviewed on the same show. And this same show, if they're doing interviews, is probably interviewing new people every week, right? So there's this evergreen source of relationships. And so now they're not all going to become clients. I'm not saying that, but you have way more cadre or relationship with these folks than a stranger. They're certainly not cold anymore. They're definitely in the warm category. And so what we like to do is look at that guest list, and we will basically sift them out into 3 buckets. So bucket 1 would be potential clients. So you're looking through, I'll go through a specific example to drive this home, but bucket 1 would be clients. Bucket 2 would be like partners, and bucket 3 would be platforms. So let's say, as an example, let's say I'm my client, Andy Janitis. So he does Google ads for like craft food brands. So not surprisingly, I met him through Fire Creek way back in the day. He solicited me, and we didn't work together in that way, but he ended up coming into my program, and he used podcast guesting like in a really big way. And this is a big part of his strategy. So he would get on a show, let's say like a Shopify oriented e-commerce show, and he would get interviewed and teach all the latest and greatest tactics for Google ads, right? And he'd be like, hey, I worked with craft food brands, and here's what we do. Here's a case study. And of course, in the audience, there are some craft food brands who are like, hey man, I'd like to get an audit and maybe work with you. And there's plenty of profit to be made there. But on this guest list side, what he could do, or his assistant could do, is look through this guest list, and there could be the founder of a chocolate company and a founder of a beer company and a founder of whatever. Well, these are all potential clients because they are craft food. They're successful. You can see their numbers right in the show notes. Like, you pretty much know, we get to pick and choose ideal client, not ideal client, ideal client. And so that's one bucket. And then second bucket of partners, he could look and say, like, who's being interviewed about Facebook ads or content or SEO, pricing, whatever, right? And so these are all people who serve his ideal client, but in a way that's different than him. So these become partnership buckets that he could create relationships with and talk to about collaboration. And it's that bucket three, I should say, would be platforms. So maybe there's some influencers, there's some people with huge Instagram accounts, there's people with other podcasts, and in all cases he can say, hey, Sally, I know you were interviewed on Joe's podcast about Shopify, so was I. And like, there's a cool kids club vibe of like, I trust you, you have credibility, I can go look at your show notes, I can even listen to your episode, and like, you're a real person and it's no longer cold, and I've got like credibility and authority. So that guest list strategy, I think, is a really tangible one that most people are like, aha, like that I could use. So hopefully that's helpful.
Totally. Yeah, no, super helpful. And I think we spend so much time crafting hooks and cold emails to try to just catch someone's attention for a blip. And what you're saying is basically just like, hey, we hung out in the same space. At some point together, we both run the Lead More podcast or whatever it might be.
Exactly. I think people think of this more if you're in the speaking circuit. Like, there's a whole strategy, like the green room strategy, right? Like, hey, there's 5 of us featured at the Story Brand Summit. We should have coffee, or we should have a Zoom call because, we're both kind of like A players. Well, that's true. And it's very hard to scale. Whereas this, one show could unlock dozens or hundreds of potential relationships, and you get to choose which ones you pursue. And you can absolutely have a virtual assistant do almost all this work. So it's not like you as the entrepreneur have to go through every time and do this.
One of the things I wanted to ask you in my program in No More Solo for helping solopreneurs scale and grow, we talked today about cold email outreach, and it was a guest speaker because I do a lot of, I'm kind of in the like post content and attract people to you media game.
Yep.
We have podcast guesting, we have cold email, and I think often maybe the takeaway is stacking different growth channels. But I also know some of the people you talked about scaled their company just on podcast guesting. So as a marketer who works with a lot of people like myself, how do you think about the strategy? Is it a spray and proliferate? Is it take one and really dominate? Or how do you think about these different growth channels?
So if we had a visual, this would be a lot easier, but I'd like people to visualize a flywheel. So John, I'm sure you're familiar with like flywheels, right?
Yep. Spin faster when you get,
Exactly. This isn't even necessarily a flywheel, but it's something that people are like, oh, I understand what you're talking about. Just think of a merry-go-round, right? If you're old enough that they weren't like, prohibited by OSHA or whatever. When we were kids, you used to have these metal contraptions on the playground, and you get 20 kids on there, and then one person would be like, spin us, right? So then you take this thing and you try to spin it, and you can, but it's really slow and hard. And then the second rotation is a little easier and a little easier. And then eventually it's spinning so fast, you can take one finger and just kind of keep it going, right? So that's effectively like a flywheel. It takes some momentum, some juice, some fuel to get it spinning. But once it spins, it's almost self-perpetuating. It still needs a little effort, but not a ton. And so like I gave a keynote this year at Traffic and Conversion Summit, and the whole thing was about how to build a marketing flywheel fueled by podcast guesting. And so if people think about this, to answer your question, I think podcast guesting can be the sole fuel source. So it can be like the thing you do, but then it feeds into this wheel. And if you think of the wheel in order of operations, sort of like the first thing you're going to do by being on a podcast is build your email list. And then you're going to think about sales, direct and long tail. Then you're going to think about relationships with the audience. Then you're going to think about relationships with the host. Then you're going to think about relationships with the other guests that I just talked a little bit about. And then you're going to think about content repurposing. So that's getting this on the other channels that you might care about, and then the final little wedge in this wheel, if you're going around clockwise and following me here, is authority. And so what happens is every time you do a podcast interview, you go around this wheel one time. And the first time you do this is kind of hard because you got to like find the show and pitch the show and do the first interview ever. But the next time you can point to that one and it gets easier to get on the second one, right? So every time you go around this, you get more email, more sales, more relationships, more content, and then more authority. Because you have more authority, you can get on bigger shows. And so Nathan Barry from ConvertKit likes to say the rules of the flywheel are every time you go around it, it's easier and more effective. And I think that that's true in this case. So I'm a big proponent of focusing on podcast guesting as the fuel source. And you don't have to do any of the other stuff, but if you actually follow that flywheel effect, you can get lots and lots and lots of momentum from it and create exponential growth. And one of those wedges that I would say that I think you were keying in on that I haven't done a great job with, if I'm being totally transparent, is content. So there's so much content created from podcast guesting that you can repurpose. So if you are in social media or you do have a YouTube channel, this is a great way to generate content in a fun way that's very scalable, and then have someone else repurpose it into whatever, written, short form, long form. And so you can really go out into the other channels, but still do most of the effort through being interviewed.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a really good way to summarize that as the flywheel. And I always say in the content bucket, like, choose the one that feels most natural, most enjoyable, right? Like, some people don't start a YouTube channel if you hate being on camera.
Yes.
If you love to write. There's a lot of interesting AI tools out there if you want to like scale writing. I always think about how, like, I'm an audio processor, and I know we're similar that way. Like, I like to do audio notes, or like, I'm happy to just click my camera and shoot because I can feel comfortable doing that. So choose the one that feels natural, to you. So,
Yep.
Before we get to my last question about superpower, I want to, the one I was still thinking about is, you've had your own as a host for 50-ish episodes. Who knows how many times you've guested. What do you think, as you think back, what are the one or two, three things that make a really good podcast guest? If you just, you might be going through the P's in your head, but the host doesn't know that. What are just the things that make a really great guest, so that when we click end record, I'm thinking like, man, I loved having Dustin on my show.
Yeah, I think on the show, some of the things that make you good is just honestly being super service oriented, right? Like being very transparent, being very honest, open, relational. If people want to think how to do things, like it's always it's everything's like an art and science, right? So there's this sort of artist side of what I'm saying and creative side that's like show up and be articulate and fun and lighthearted, and like there's some of that. But if you want to like have an engineer hat and like, how do I produce that? The really simple way to think about it is as a story brand framework of being the guide to the audience. And that's everything you do is leading with empathy and following with authority, which just basically means I know exactly if someone's listening and they were in COVID and like they had a physical product business or their marketing business got shut down and they were completely lost. Trust me, I was there. And like, I'm not sitting here with a 7-figure business today acting like it was easy. It was really hard work. Luckily though, I went through a lot of trials, tribulations, and bouts of depression, figured it out, and I'm really blessed because I've worked with over 200 people to generate $25 million doing this. I just kind of rattled that off, but I started with empathy.
Yeah.
And so if someone's listening and like, like I'm dependent on referrals, my business has struggled, and like he gets it. He's been in my shoes, and I have authority though. It's not just like Debbie Downer. It's like, and the good news is there's a way out, right? And so I think if you think of your stories in terms of empathy and authority, that helps a lot. And then the final thing I would say, both as a host and someone who's guested a lot, I think the just being a really cool person to the host, right? Like, and so there's the things you do in the interview, which are important, but also like being prepared, like following up ahead of time to like confirm, hey, I got you down for tomorrow. This is what we're going to talk about. Are we good? Sending them a thank you gift, maybe. The table stakes that will put you in the top 5% of all guests ever is leave them an iTunes review and tell them.
Yeah, I remember that was such an easy takeaway from
easy, but like
no one does it. No one does it. Yeah.
If you do that, they're going to remember you. I guarantee they're going to remember you. And then if you, if you do have some sort of social media presence and you share the episode and you just talk about like legitimately why you enjoyed it and encourage people to follow that host because you think they're cool, like that goes a long way. So a lot of it's just like being a good human. And then there's the more, tactical things to do in the interview. But I think if you want to be remembered and referred as a great guest, teach well, stay in your zone of genius, be transparent, and then like be cool to the host. And then as it gets published and you have great interactions with the audience, like let them have a feedback loop and let the host know like, hey, John, it was awesome. Like Marcy from your audience reached out, we had a call. I think she got a ton of value. I just want to thank you again for having me on. You as the host are gonna be like, that's so cool. Like, I know someone actually got value from Dustin's interview, and that happens all the time, but we as the host don't often get that feedback loop.
Yeah, I think that's great. And then it's almost like doing sales, right? Like where the 5 Ps are outbound sales to try to get on podcast. And then if you do that well, it almost unlocks this inbound sales of podcasts coming to you, right? Like, hey, Dustin told me you're a great guest. Like, I'd love to have you on my show.
Yeah. So to answer your question earlier, I've been on something like 80 podcasts. I've cold pitched like 8 or 10 of them. Like, so when I talk about all this getting started, writing a pitch, you got to do that to start. But once the flywheel starts, it's all inbound and or adjacent, right? Like it's the thing I said, like, hey, I was on John's podcast. Jordan, I noticed you're on John's podcast. Like, I'd love to connect with you. That sort of dynamic. And it's way easier than cold pitching. It's just if people are listening, they haven't done this, you can definitely get through that initial barrier. But yeah, it totally should pick up its own momentum if you do it consistently.
Interesting. That's great. All right. So I teased it out. The last question I always like to ask on the Lead More podcast is what's your superpower? Because it makes us, initially it was us Midwesterners who aren't really good at bragging about ourselves. And you're a Southern Illinois guy, so you probably count. What's your superpower? What's the thing you do better than anyone else? Having worked with you a little bit, I have a guess, but I want to see what you say.
I'm curious your guess, but what I will say is, I'd say number one is giving people clarity. And number two is giving people connection. And I didn't recognize this in myself, but my mastermind group that John's a part of now, but before we did an in-person event. And one of the things we did, again, I guess putting on this cape, I had this idea of like, man, wouldn't it be cool if everyone that came to this dinner got told by the other people what their unique ability is, right? Or like, what is their superpower? And so we kind of independently and anonymously sort of gave each other this feedback. And then I had the pleasure of distilling it and handing it as like a gift to people at the table. And they got to read a synopsis of what everyone thought about them, who knows them very deeply from the mastermind. And mine, the theme was definitely like clarity and connection. Like everyone was like, you helped me get so clear on what I really want, or you really helped me with my target market, or you helped me with my messaging. And then and you put me in proximity to like these amazing people that changed my life. Right. And so I feel like clarity and connection has become my 1-2 superpower. And even though I use podcast guesting as a vehicle, hopefully people heard in the thread of some of the stuff I shared today, I like it so much because it's a great vehicle towards clarity and connection. Right. Like I think why I'm so drawn to it and why I'm so enamored with helping people use this to get that.
Yep, I can see that. That totally makes sense. Cool. Well, awesome. Lastly, if somebody is curious about the accelerator or 7-figure leap, just where do we follow and get in touch with you, Dustin?
I appreciate that. Yeah. So 7-figure leap, jumping, 7figureleap.com is our home base. If someone's like really into this idea of podcast guesting and they want some very tactical, like practical help, we put together a scorecard. It's 7figureleap.com/scorecard. And it is pretty specific, but it's going to go basically through the 5 Ps, and you're going to be able to rate where you're good, where you're not so good. And it's going to basically give you a game plan for which of these things you need to address to really rock it with podcast guesting. So if you go to 7figureleap.com/scorecard, it's totally free, take you about 5 minutes, but it's super insightful when you get those results.
Awesome. We'll put that in the show notes as well. So, all right. Thanks so much for sharing your time and your wisdom and just being a good guy. Really appreciate you, Dustin.
Thanks, John. Appreciate you too, buddy. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Dustin, for coming on the show. Thanks for sharing your time and your wisdom. We'll make sure to link up the scorecard that you mentioned, as well as where you can find Dustin online. If you've ever been a guest on a podcast, go and leave that review for that person. Dustin shared that as like sort of a hack, little pro tip that's so easy and most people just don't do. And so if you've ever been a guest on my show, or if you just listened to the show for many, many times, I encourage you, go to Apple, go to Spotify, leave us a review. You can click the 5 stars. You can say who your favorite episode was. It's really helpful for us at Lead More, for people to find the show, to discover it, to choose to listen or not. So I really appreciate that. So remember, you can subscribe wherever you listen. We're on YouTube now in video format. And just most importantly, leaders, take care and be well.